In 1908, a fire consumed a farmhouse in rural Indiana, leaving behind what appeared to be the bodies of a mother and her 3 children. The authorities saw it as a tragedy. The neighbors whispered about bad luck, but when investigators began digging into the charred remains of Belle Gunness's property, they uncovered something that would horrify the nation. Beneath the soil of what locals now call Murder Farm, they found body after body, dismembered, poisoned, and buried like discarded livestock. That woman wasn't a victim of the fire. She was one of America's most prolific serial killers, and she might have escaped justice entirely. Belle Gunness was born Brynhild Paulsdatter Sturseth in November 1859 in Selbu, Norway, the youngest of 8 children in a stonemason's family. Life in rural Norway was harsh, and at 14, young Brynhild was already working neighboring farms, milking cattle and herding livestock to scrape together enough money for passage to America. She was tall for a woman of her era, standing nearly 6 feet, with a powerful build that would serve her well in the brutal work ahead. In 1881, at 22, she made the journey across the Atlantic, processed through Castle Garden, and like so many immigrants, she changed her name. Brynhild became Belle, and she headed to Chicago to join her sister Nellie, who had immigrated years earlier. In Chicago, Belle worked as a domestic servant, then took a job at a butcher shop, cutting up animal carcasses with the precision and detachment that would later characterize her crimes. She was physically imposing, weighing between 200 and 250 pounds, with hands that could wield a cleaver as easily as they could fold dough. It was here, surrounded by the blood and bones of slaughtered animals, that Belle learned the anatomy of death. In 1884, Belle married Mads Ditlev Anton Sørensen, a fellow Norwegian immigrant, and together they opened a small candy store. But Belle had already begun to see opportunity in tragedy. The store mysteriously burned to the ground shortly after opening, and Belle collected the insurance money. Then their home burned down too, another insurance payout. 2 of their children, Caroline and Axel, died from what doctors called inflammation of the large intestine, but Belle had conveniently insured both children beforehand. Each death brought her money, and each fire taught her that destruction could be profitable. Then, on July 30th, 1900, Mads Sørensen died suddenly on the one day when his 2 life insurance policies overlapped, maximizing Belle's payout to $8,500. The first doctor to examine Mads believed he'd been poisoned with strychnine, but the family physician, who had been treating Mads for an enlarged heart, overruled the diagnosis and declared it heart failure. Mads's relatives suspected murder, but without an autopsy, Belle walked away with the insurance money and the freedom to kill again. With her insurance windfall, Belle moved to LaPorte, Indiana, where she purchased a 42-acre pig farm at the end of McClung Road. It was isolated, quiet, and perfect for what she had planned. In April 1902, she married Peter Gunness, a local butcher and widower with 2 young daughters. But Belle wasn't interested in being a stepmother. 1 week after the wedding, Peter's infant daughter died while alone in the house with Belle. 8 months later, Peter himself was dead, allegedly killed when a sausage grinder fell from a high shelf and crushed his skull. The coroner suspected murder and convened a jury, but without concrete evidence, Belle collected another $3,000 in insurance money. Peter's older daughter, Swanhild, was quickly taken away by relatives, making her the only child to survive Belle's household. It was around this time that Belle discovered a more efficient way to fund her lifestyle: matrimonial advertisements. In 1905, she began placing personal ads in Norwegian language newspapers across the Midwest, targeting wealthy bachelors and recent immigrants who might be carrying cash. Her ads were carefully crafted to lure the desperate and the lonely. One read, "Personal, comely widow who owns a large farm in one of the finest districts in LaPorte County, Indiana, desires to make the acquaintance of a gentleman equally well provided, with view of joining fortunes. No replies by letter considered unless sender is willing to follow answer with personal visit. Triflers need not apply." The men who responded to Belle's ads were walking into a death trap. She corresponded with them for weeks or months, building trust, expressing affection, and encouraging them to bring their life savings when they visited. Her letters were warm, romantic, and utterly convincing. To her final victim, Andrew Helgelian, she wrote, "My heart beats in wild rapture for you, my Andrew. I love you. Come prepared to stay forever." And they did come prepared, carrying thousands of dollars in cash, selling their farms and businesses, burning their bridges behind them. Belle's method was coldly efficient. When the men arrived at her farm, she would greet them warmly, feed them a hearty meal, and encourage them to stay the night. But the food and coffee were laced with strychnine, a common rat poison that Belle kept in abundance. As the men writhed in agony, Belle would finish them off with a meat cleaver or an axe, then dismember their bodies with the same skill she'd learned in the Chicago butcher shop. She buried the remains in shallow graves around her property, sometimes in the hog pen, sometimes near the lake, always with a layer of quicklime to speed decomposition. The victims came one after another. Henry Gerholt, a Wisconsin farmhand, wrote to his family that he liked the farm and requested seed potatoes, then was never heard from again. John Moe, Olaf Svenerud, Ole B. Butzberg, Andrew Helgelian, each followed the same pattern. They answered Belle's ad, corresponded with her, traveled to LaPorte with their life savings, and vanished without a trace. Their families received no word, filed no missing person reports, because these men had told everyone they were starting new lives in Indiana. But Belle's system had one fatal flaw. Andrew Helgelian had a brother. Assel Helgelian became suspicious when Andrew's letters stopped abruptly in January 1908. He wrote to Belle, demanding to know his brother's whereabouts. Belle replied that Andrew had gone to Norway on business, but Assel wasn't convinced. He threatened to come to LaPorte himself to search for his brother, and that threat terrified Belle. She knew that if Asla arrived and began asking questions, her entire operation would unravel. Belle's solution was characteristically brutal. She hired a drifter and former farmhand named Ray Lamphere to help around the property, but their relationship quickly soured. Lamphere had seen too much, knew too many of Belle's secrets, and when she tried to fire him in February 1908, he threatened to expose her. Belle began spreading rumors that Lamphere was threatening to burn down her house with her children inside, setting him up as the perfect fall guy for what she planned to do next. On the night of April 27th, 1908, fire consumed the Gunnis farmhouse. When the flames died down, investigators found the bodies of Belle's 3 children, Lucy and Myrtle Sorensen, ages 9 and 11, and 5-year-old Philip Gunnis, along with the headless corpse of an adult woman. The body was initially identified as Belle, but something was wrong. The corpse was too small, too light. Neighbors who had seen Belle estimated her weight at 250 pounds, but this body weighed maybe 150. Still, authorities arrested Ray Lamphere for arson and murder. It was Asle Helgelian's arrival that changed everything. He had read about the fire in the newspapers and traveled to La Porte, still searching for his brother. As he walked the property with a former farmhand, they noticed soft depressions in the ground near the hog pen. When they began digging, they found a gunny sack containing human remains. Then another and another. What followed was one of the most macabre excavations in American criminal history. Over the next several days, investigators unearthed body after body from Belle's property. Some were intact enough to identify, others had been chopped into pieces and scattered. Many showed traces of strychnine poisoning. The remains of Andrew Helgelian were found exactly where his brothers suspected they would be, dismembered and buried in the hog pen with quicklime. In total, investigators found the remains of at least 14 people, though some estimates put the number as high as 40. The discovery made headlines across the nation. Families from across the Midwest came forward with stories of missing relatives who had answered Belle's matrimonial ads. The farm became a gruesome tourist attraction, with thousands of people arriving by train to see Murder Farm for themselves. They found a property that had become a literal killing field, where Belle had systematically murdered and butchered human beings for years. But the question remained, was Belle Gunnis really dead? The headless corpse found in the basement had been too small to be her, and her head was never found despite extensive searching. Days later, investigators discovered a set of dental bridges in the rubble, which a local dentist identified as belonging to Belle, but many remained skeptical. The bridges could have been planted, torn from Belle's mouth, and left behind to throw off investigators. Ray Lamphere was tried for arson and murder, but the case was complicated by the fact that he was supposedly defending a woman who had engaged in the wholesale slaughter of humanity. Lamphere was acquitted of murder when traces of strychnine were found in the children's bodies, proving they had been poisoned before the fire, but he was convicted of arson and sentenced to prison. He died of tuberculosis just 1 year later, but before his death, he made a chilling confession to a pastor. According to Lamphere, Belle had killed 42 men during their time together. She would spike their coffee with strychnine, bash their heads in with a meat cleaver, cut up their bodies, and put them in sacks. Lamphere's job was the planting, burying the remains around the property. He also revealed that Belle had staged her own death, killing an unknown woman, decapitating her to prevent identification, and placing the body in the basement before setting the house on fire. Belle had withdrawn most of her money from local banks in the days before the fire and had likely escaped while the authorities focused on fighting the blaze. For decades after the fire, Belle Gunnis sightings were reported across the country. In 1931, a woman named Esther Carlson was arrested in Los Angeles for poisoning a Norwegian-American man and attempting to steal his money. Carlson bore an uncanny resemblance to Belle and was about the same age Belle would have been if she had survived. There was no record of Carlson before 1908, and she used the same methods as Bell: poison and theft. But Carlson died in jail before her trial, taking her secrets with her. In 2007, forensic anthropologist Stephen Naraki and a team from the University of Indianapolis exhumed what was believed to be Bell's grave at Forest Home Cemetery near Chicago. They hoped to use DNA analysis to finally determine whether Bell had died in the fire or escaped. But when they opened the coffin, they found the bones of children mixed with the adult remains, bones that didn't belong to the three children who had died in the fire. This suggested that Bell had killed even more children than investigators had realized, and it cast further doubt on whether the headless corpse had really been hers. The DNA analysis proved inconclusive. Samples from an envelope Bell had licked and sent to one of her suitors were too degraded to provide useful results. Even a DNA sample provided by a direct descendant of Bell's family in Norway couldn't definitively identify the remains. The truth about Belle Gunness's fate remains a mystery more than a century later. What we do know is that Belle Gunness was unlike any serial killer before or since. She combined the methodical poisoning typical of female serial killers with the brutal dismemberment more common among men. She was a businesswoman of death, turning murder into a profitable enterprise that funded her lifestyle for nearly 2 decades. She preyed on the dreams and desperation of immigrants seeking love and opportunity in America, transforming her pig farm into a slaughterhouse for human beings. Bell's story reveals the dark side of the American dream, where the promise of prosperity and new beginnings could be exploited by those willing to kill for profit. Her crimes were discovered during a time when America was transforming from a rural to an urban society, and many saw her case as evidence of the moral decay that threatened to destroy traditional values. But Belle Gunness wasn't a product of societal breakdown. She was a calculating predator who saw opportunity in others' vulnerability. The exact number of Belle's victims will never be known. The isolated location of her farm, the efficiency of her methods, and the transient nature of her targets allowed her to operate for years without detection. She may have killed 14 people, or 40, or even more. Each victim represented not just a life lost, but a family destroyed, dreams shattered, and questions that would never be answered. Today, the Gunness property is private farmland, but the story of Murder Farm lives on in the collective memory of LaPorte, Indiana. The local historical society maintains an exhibit about Belle's crimes, acknowledging the dark chapter in their community's history while honoring the victims who were forgotten for so long. Children in LaPorte grow up hearing stories about Hell's Belle, the woman who turned a quiet pig farm into one of America's most notorious killing fields. Whether Belle Gunness died in that fire in 1908 or lived to kill again under another name, her legacy remains as one of the most prolific and cunning serial killers in American history. She proved that evil doesn't always announce itself with madness or rage. Sometimes it comes wearing the mask of a lonely widow, promising love and partnership while sharpening the knife. In the end, Belle Gunness showed that the most terrifying monsters are often the ones we never see coming, the ones who kill not in passion or fury, but with the cold calculation of a business transaction. And somewhere in the darkness of history, Her shadow still haunts the question that has never been answered. Did she really die in that fire, or is she still out there, waiting for the next lonely heart to answer her call? In the winter of 1610, amid the snow-covered peaks of what is now Slovakia, soldiers arrived at a castle that locals whispered about in hushed tones. What they found inside the walls of Chaktich Castle would shock even hardened men of war. Bodies of young women, some still breathing, others mutilated beyond recognition. Blood-stained torture devices that scattered throughout stone chambers. And presiding over it all, a woman of noble birth who had turned her ancestral home into a slaughterhouse. Her name was Elizabeth Bathory, and she had just been caught in the act of conducting what investigators would later call one of the most sadistic killing sprees in recorded history. But this story doesn't begin with screams echoing through castle corridors. It begins with a child born into unimaginable privilege who would grow up to become what many consider the most prolific female serial killer of all time. Elizabeth Bathory was born on August 7th, 1560, into one of the most powerful, noble families in Hungary. The Bathory name carried weight across Eastern Europe. Her father, Baron George VI Bathory, controlled vast territories in Transylvania. Her uncle, Stephen Bathory, was King of Poland, Grand Duke of Lithuania, and Prince of Transylvania. This wasn't just wealth, this was power that shaped kingdoms and decided the fate of nations. Elizabeth spent her childhood at Exeter Castle, surrounded by luxury that most people couldn't even imagine. But even as a young girl, something was wrong. She suffered from violent epileptic seizures that would leave her writhing on the floor, her eyes rolling back, her body convulsing uncontrollably. Some believed these episodes, possibly caused by inbreeding within her noble family, damaged something fundamental in her mind. Others pointed to the horrific violence she witnessed as a child as the true source of her corruption. In that era, public executions were entertainment, and Elizabeth had a front row seat to some of the most brutal punishments imaginable. She once watched authorities slit open the belly of a living horse, stuff a condemned criminal inside, and sew it shut, leaving both man and animal to die in agony. But rather than turning away in horror like other children might, Elizabeth watched with fascination. She was studying, learning, absorbing lessons in cruelty that would serve her well in the years to come. At age 11, Elizabeth was engaged to Count Ferenc Nadasdy, a political arrangement between two powerful families. But even before marriage, dark rumors surrounded the young countess. At 13, she allegedly gave birth to a child fathered by a peasant boy. When Nadasdy discovered the affair, his response was swift and brutal. According to legend, he had the boy castrated and then torn apart by dogs while Elizabeth watched. The child was secretly given away, hidden from the world, to preserve the family's reputation. In 1575, when Elizabeth was just 14, she married Nadasdy in a ceremony that attracted 4,500 guests. It was a spectacle of wealth and power, but it was also the beginning of something much darker. Nadasdy was known as the Black Knight, a celebrated warrior who had earned his reputation fighting the Ottoman Empire. But his skills on the battlefield were matched by his appetite for cruelty at home. Ferenc Nadasdy didn't just tolerate his wife's violent tendencies, he encouraged them. He taught Elizabeth new forms of torture, sharing techniques he had learned while interrogating prisoners of war. He would send her letters from military campaigns, not filled with romantic words, but with detailed instructions on how to inflict maximum pain on their servants. One of his favorite methods was covering servant girls in honey and leaving them outside to be devoured by insects. Another involved placing burning paper between their toes and watching them scream. The newlyweds made their home at Nadasti Castle in Sarvar, where they transformed their residence into a laboratory of human suffering. Elizabeth received spiked gloves from her husband, designed specifically for beating servants. But even Ferentz's influence paled in comparison to that of Elizabeth's aunt, Clara Bathory. Clara introduced Elizabeth to a shadowy world of occultists, alchemists, and supposed witches who taught her that pain wasn't just pleasurable, it was powerful. They convinced her that the blood of innocence could grant eternal youth and beauty. For years, their reign of terror was contained within their castle walls. Servants died regularly, but in an age when the nobility held absolute power over the peasantry, these deaths were easily covered up. Local authorities looked the other way, either bought off or too frightened to challenge such a powerful family. Besides, who would miss a few peasant girls? But in 1604, everything changed. Ferenc Nadasti died, some say from mysterious leg pain that left him bedridden and screaming. Others suspect poison administered by his own wife. With her husband gone, Elizabeth inherited vast estates, enormous wealth, and most importantly, the freedom to indulge her darkest desires without restraint. Elizabeth moved to Chaktiche Castle, a fortress perched high in the Carpathian Mountains, where she would spend the next 6 years perfecting her art of murder. She was no longer content with merely killing servants. She began luring young women from noble families, promising them education in courtly etiquette and social advancement. Parents eagerly sent their daughters to learn from such a distinguished countess, never imagining they were delivering them to their deaths. What happened within those castle walls defies human comprehension. According to witness testimony collected during her eventual trial, Elizabeth had developed an elaborate system of torture that combined medieval brutality with psychological sadism. She would force girls to undress and stand naked in freezing chambers while she threw ice water over their bodies, watching them slowly freeze to death. Other victims were covered in honey and left outside for bees and ants to devour their exposed flesh. Elizabeth's favorite instrument was a pair of scissors, which she used to mutilate her victims' faces and bodies with surgical precision. She would cut off fingers one by one, slice open veins to watch the blood flow, and carefully peel away strips of skin. Some girls were beaten so severely their bodies turned black as charcoal, their bones splintering under the relentless assault. Others were hung from the ceiling in spiked cages, left to slowly die from their wounds. But Elizabeth's true obsession was blood. She believed that drinking the blood of young virgins would preserve her youth and beauty. Witnesses described her biting chunks of flesh from her victims' breasts, faces, and arms, consuming their blood like a vampire. She would position herself beneath hanging victims, allowing their blood to drip onto her naked body, convinced that this crimson baptism was the secret to eternal life. The most chilling detail of all was Elizabeth's meticulous record-keeping. Several witnesses claimed she maintained a ledger written in her own hand, documenting every single victim. This macabre diary allegedly contained the names and details of 650 women and girls she had murdered. The book was never found, but its existence suggested a level of cold calculation that went beyond mere sadism. Elizabeth wasn't killing in fits of rage. She was conducting a systematic campaign of extermination. For 6 years, young women disappeared into Chaktache Castle and never emerged. Local families began hiding their daughters, refusing to send them to the Countess, despite the social advantages such an education might provide. But Elizabeth adapted, sending her servants into villages to kidnap girls outright or luring victims with promises of work as maids and seamstresses. What finally brought down the Blood Countess wasn't the murder of peasants or servants, but her fatal mistake of targeting the daughters of nobility. In 1609, rumors reached the Habsburg court that Elizabeth had begun killing girls from aristocratic families. Unlike peasant deaths, these murders couldn't be ignored or covered up. King Matthias II ordered an investigation, appointing Elizabeth's own cousin, Count Georgi Thurzo, to lead the inquiry. Thurzo, who had his own political ambitions and saw an opportunity to seize Elizabeth's vast wealth, launched a thorough investigation. Over the course of months, he collected testimony from more than 300 witnesses. Servants who had escaped the castle told horrific stories of torture chambers and mass graves. Local residents described seeing carts loaded with bodies being removed from the castle under cover of darkness. Some witnesses claimed to have seen the physical evidence themselves: mutilated corpses, torture devices stained with blood, rooms where the walls were splattered with gore. On December 30th, 1610, Thurzo arrived at Chaktache Castle with a contingent of soldiers and royal officials. What they found corroborated the worst of the testimony. According to Thurzo's own letter to his wife, they discovered one dead girl in the castle and another barely alive, presumably Elizabeth's next victim. The investigation that followed uncovered evidence of systematic torture and murder spanning 2 decades. Elizabeth Bathory was arrested along with 4 of her servants, Dorothea Sentes, Ilona Jo, Katerina Benica, and Janos Ujvari. The servants were charged as accomplices and put on trial in 1611. Under torture, they confessed to participating in the murders and provided gruesome details about their methods. They described how Elizabeth would stick burning pokers into girls' mouths and noses, how she would sew their lips together, and how she forced them to cook and eat their own flesh. The trial was a sensation across Europe. Even hardened judges were appalled by the testimony. One servant, forced to watch her mistress torture a young girl, described how Elizabeth placed her fingers in the victim's mouth and pulled until the sides split open. Another testified that Elizabeth would have red-hot coins pressed into the palms of servant girls, watching their flesh sizzle and burn. But perhaps the most damning testimony came from Ilona Jo, Elizabeth's former wet nurse, who admitted to killing about 50 victims herself. She described how Elizabeth would have girls brought to her bed even when she was ill, so she could slap and bite them. Sometimes Elizabeth bit them so hard they died from their wounds. Jo also testified that Elizabeth kept detailed records of her victims, meticulously documenting each murder like entries in a business ledger. The servants were found guilty and executed with the same brutality they had inflicted on others. 3 were burned alive, while Janos Uivari, the youngest, was shown mercy and merely beheaded. But Elizabeth herself, protected by her noble status, was never put on trial. Instead, she was sentenced to house arrest, confined to a few rooms in Chaktich Castle for the rest of her life. Some accounts claim Elizabeth was literally walled up, with only small slits left for food and air to pass through. Others suggest she was allowed to move freely within certain chambers, but forbidden from leaving the castle. What's certain is that she spent her final years as a prisoner in the very fortress where she had committed her crimes. Elizabeth Bathory died on August 21st, 1614, at the age of 54. She was found dead on the floor of her chamber, apparently having died in her sleep. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The woman who had murdered hundreds in pursuit of eternal youth had died an ordinary death, aging and alone. She was initially buried in the castle church, but local villagers were so outraged they threatened to exhume and desecrate her corpse. Her body was quietly moved to her family estate at Exeter, where she was buried in unmarked obscurity. But even in death, Elizabeth Bathory's story refused to stay buried. Over the centuries, her legend grew far beyond the facts of her case. Writers added increasingly sensational details: that she bathed in vats filled with virgin's blood, that she was a literal vampire who never aged, that she practiced black magic and made pacts with demons. These embellishments, most of them created more than a century after her death, transformed Elizabeth from a historical figure into a mythological monster. The truth about Elizabeth Bathory remains hotly contested even today. Modern historians have raised serious questions about the evidence against her. They point out that many of the 300 witnesses provided only hearsay testimony, repeating rumors they had heard rather than describing events they had personally witnessed. The investigation was led by her cousin Thurzo, who had clear political motivations for destroying her. The Habsburg court owed Elizabeth enormous sums of money that were conveniently written off after her arrest. Her vast estates were divided among family members who had advanced knowledge of her impending capture. Some scholars argue that Elizabeth was the victim of an elaborate conspiracy, a powerful woman destroyed by men who couldn't tolerate her independence and wealth. They note that she had supported her nephew, Prince Gabor Bathory of Transylvania, who was in conflict with the ruling Habsburgs, potentially making her a political liability. Her refusal to remarry after her husband's death, unusual for a woman of her era, may have been seen as a threat to the established order. The confessions of her servants, extracted under torture, would be considered worthless in any modern court. The alleged registry of victims was never found, despite extensive searches. Most damning of all, there are no surviving documents showing that anyone had ever filed a formal complaint against Elizabeth, which was extraordinary in an age when even minor disputes between nobles were meticulously recorded. But the conspiracy theory has its own problems. Letters written as early as 1602 by a local priest described excessive cruelty by both Elizabeth and her husband toward their servants. Witnesses described seeing physical evidence of torture and murder. Bodies were found on her property during the investigation. It's possible that some of the allegations were exaggerated for political purposes, but completely fabricating such an extensive conspiracy involving hundreds of witnesses would have been nearly impossible. The most likely truth is that Elizabeth Bathory was indeed guilty of murdering servants and peasants, but that the scope of her crimes was deliberately inflated by her enemies. She may have killed dozens rather than hundreds, and the more sensational elements of her story, particularly the blood-bathing rituals, were probably added later to enhance her legend. But even a conservative interpretation of the evidence suggests that Elizabeth was responsible for multiple murders, making her one of history's most prolific female serial killers. What makes Elizabeth Bathory's story so enduring isn't just the brutality of her alleged crimes, but what she represents. In an age when women had limited power, she wielded enormous authority over life and death. She challenged gender norms by refusing to remarry and maintaining control over her estates. Whether she was a sadistic killer or a political scapegoat, her story reveals the dangerous intersection of absolute power, gender expectations, and political intrigue in early modern Europe. Today, Chaktiche Castle stands in ruins, a tourist attraction where visitors can walk through the chambers where Elizabeth allegedly committed her crimes. The town below has embraced its dark history, featuring exhibitions about the Blood Countess and selling souvenirs celebrating her macabre legacy. But for all the commercialization and mythologizing, serious questions remain unanswered. Was Elizabeth Bathory the most prolific female serial killer in history? A woman so consumed by vanity and sadism that she murdered hundreds in pursuit of eternal youth? Or was she a powerful woman destroyed by a patriarchal society that couldn't tolerate her independence, her wealth, and her refusal to conform to expected roles? The truth, like so much of history, probably lies somewhere in between. What we know for certain is that Elizabeth Bathory's name has become synonymous with female evil, inspiring countless books, films, and legends over more than 4 centuries. She has been called Countess Dracula, the Blood Countess, and Lady of Chaktic. Her story allegedly influenced Bram Stoker's creation of Count Dracula, though scholars debate whether there's any direct connection. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Elizabeth Bathory's legacy isn't the question of her guilt or innocence. It's the fact that in an age when the powerful preyed upon the powerless with impunity, her crimes were only investigated when she made the mistake of targeting the wrong victims. For years, possibly decades, young women disappeared into Chaktic Castle, and nobody with the power to stop it cared enough to investigate. It was only when daughters of the nobility began dying that the wheels of justice finally turned. Elizabeth Bathory died nearly 400 years ago, but her story continues to fascinate and horrify us because it reveals uncomfortable truths about power, privilege, and the expendability of the powerless. Whether she was a monster or a victim, her legend serves as a dark reminder of what can happen when absolute power meets absolute corruption, and when society values some lives far more than others. In the end, Elizabeth Bathory achieved a kind of immortality, though not the kind she allegedly sought through blood and torture. Her name lives on not as a symbol of eternal youth, but as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the ease with which history can be written by those who control the narrative. She remains one of the most notorious figures in the annals of crime, her true story forever obscured by centuries of myth, legend, and political manipulation. In the sterile corridors of Somerset Medical Center, where the hum of machines blended with the whispered prayers of families. Something far more sinister than disease was stalking the patients. It moved with quiet precision, dressed in scrubs, carrying syringes filled not with healing, but with death itself. The killer wasn't hiding in shadows or breaking down doors. He was there every night, trusted with the most vulnerable lives, wearing the face of compassion while harboring something infinitely darker. His name was Charles Cullen, and for 16 years, he was the most dangerous person in every hospital where he worked. But unlike the monsters you've heard of, Charles didn't Cullen hide in the darkness. He lived in the light, respected by colleagues, trusted by families, invisible in plain sight. What made him terrifying wasn't his ability to kill, but his ability to keep caring, keep smiling, keep being the good nurse everyone believed him to be. Charles Edmund Cullen was born on February 22, 1960, in West Orange, New Jersey, as the youngest of 8 children in a working-class Catholic family. Death came early to the Cullen household. When Charles was just 7 months old, his father, Edmund, a bus driver, died suddenly, leaving behind a widow and 8 children to fend for themselves. It was as if death had marked the family from the beginning, claiming victim after victim in a slow, relentless procession that would define Charles's understanding of the world. By the time he was 9 years old, something had already broken inside him, not from abuse or neglect, but from a growing, suffocating awareness that life was fragile, meaningless, and always ending. That year, he tried to kill himself by mixing chemicals from a chemistry set and drinking the concoction. When that didn't work, he tried other methods, not because of some dramatic trauma, but because the world felt empty, hollow, like a stage play where everyone was pretending life mattered. In high school, Charles became obsessed with the works of Dostoevsky, particularly Crime and Punishment, a novel about a man who commits murder and wrestles with the psychological aftermath. He was bullied mercilessly, a quiet, awkward boy who didn't fit in anywhere. When his mother died in a car accident during his senior year, he dropped out of school entirely. Death had taken everything that mattered, and Charles was left with a bitter understanding that nothing in life was permanent except the ending. He enlisted in the Navy, hoping military structure might give his life meaning. Instead, he found more isolation. Serving as a missile technician on nuclear submarines, Charles was known for bizarre behavior that made his crewmates uncomfortable. He would sometimes operate controls while wearing surgical masks and hospital gowns for no apparent reason. His fellow sailors saw him as strange, unsettling, someone who didn't quite fit with the rest of humanity. After his discharge, Charles decided to become a nurse. To everyone who knew him, it seemed like a perfect fit. Here was a quiet, sensitive man who had known loss and could bring compassion to others in their darkest moments. He graduated from nursing school in 1986 and started his first job at St. Barnabas Medical Center in New Jersey. No one suspected that within 2 years he would commit his first murder. Charles claimed his first victim in 1988, a patient whose name has been lost to time, whose death was written off as natural in a place where death was common. But for Charles, it wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. He had discovered something that gave him power in a world that had taken everything away from him. He could decide who lived and who died. He could play God in a universe that had shown him only chaos. His weapon of choice was digoxin, a powerful heart medication that in small doses regulated heartbeat, but in larger amounts caused complete heart block, irregular rhythms, and death. It was readily available in the cardiac units where Charles worked, and he quickly learned how to exploit the computerized drug dispensing system. He would order pain medication or other innocuous drugs, knowing they were stored in the same drawer as digoxin. He could cancel orders immediately after placing them, but the drawer would still open, allowing him to take whatever he wanted without leaving a digital trail. Charles would inject the digoxin directly into IV bags, creating lethal cocktails that would be administered to unsuspecting patients. The beauty of his method was its invisibility. In a hospital where people died every day, who would notice one more death? Who would suspect that the quiet, competent nurse was systematically murdering the people he was supposed to heal? At St. Barnabas, the killing spree began slowly, but by 1991, something was terribly wrong. Patients were dying unexpectedly, and staff began noticing contaminated IV bags with needle marks around the perimeter. Someone was injecting something into the saline and heparin bags stored in supply closets. When they tested the bags, they found insulin, another of Charles's preferred weapons. Instead of calling police, the hospital conducted an internal investigation. They suspected Charles was responsible, but they couldn't prove it. So they did what hospitals do when faced with liability. They quietly encouraged him to leave. In January 1992, Charles resigned from St. Barnabas, and with him went the contaminated IV bags. The insulin overdoses stopped immediately. Charles Cullen was free to kill again, and the system had just helped him find his next hunting ground. What followed was a 16-year journey through the medical system, a tour of hospitals and nursing homes where Charles would work just long enough to claim more victims before moving on. Warren Hospital in Phillipsburg became his next stop, where he murdered 3 elderly women with digoxin overdoses. One of his victims, a 91-year-old cancer patient, told her family that a sneaky male nurse had injected her while she slept. Her son protested that her death wasn't natural, but the hospital dismissed the claims and even gave Charles a lie detector test, which he passed. It wasn't that Charles was particularly skilled at deception. It's that no one wanted to believe that a nurse, someone sworn to do no harm, could be systematically murdering patients. The cognitive dissonance was too great. Hospitals would rather believe in coincidence, bad luck, or natural causes than face the terrifying reality that they had hired a predator. Charles moved through Hunterdon Medical Center, Morristown Memorial Hospital, and then crossed into Pennsylvania, working at facilities in the Lehigh Valley. At each location, the pattern repeated: suspicious deaths, internal investigations, quiet departures. Sometimes he was fired for poor performance or strange behavior. Sometimes he left on his own when the pressure mounted. But he always found another job because hospitals desperately needed nurses, and confidentiality laws prevented previous employers from sharing their suspicions. His personal life was equally chaotic. He went through a bitter divorce, filed for bankruptcy, and was hospitalized multiple times for depression and suicide attempts. But somehow, this troubled man with a history of mental instability and suspicious patient deaths kept finding work in hospitals. The system wasn't just failing to stop him, it was actively enabling him. The killing never stopped. Charles used insulin to send patients into diabetic comas, epinephrine to cause fatal heart arrhythmias, and various other medications to create the perfect storms that would end lives without leaving obvious traces. He didn't discriminate. His victims included recovering patients, elderly individuals, young adults, people who were getting better and should have gone home to their families. Some victims survived his initial attempts, which only made Charles more determined. He would try again and again, sometimes switching medications until he found the right combination to finish the job. He would roam hospital units at night, reading charts, looking for patients with do not resuscitate orders, or those with multiple organ failure, people whose deaths wouldn't raise as many questions. What drove Charles Cullen wasn't mercy, despite his later claims to the contrary. Many of his victims weren't terminally ill. Some were young, healthy people recovering from routine procedures. Michael Stranko was a 21-year-old college student who had surgery to remove his spleen. He was recovering well when Charles administered a fatal dose of digoxin. Eleanor Stuker was a 60-year-old asthma patient who was feeling better and planning to go home when Charles decided her life should end. The truth about Charles Cullen's motivations is far more disturbing than any mercy-killing narrative. As journalist Charles Graeber, who wrote extensively about the case, observed, "It was never about anybody but Charlie Cullen. He sees himself as a victim, and as a victim, he's entitled to lash out in any way he wants to make things right." When his personal life spiraled out of control, when he was losing custody battles, facing financial ruin, or dealing with depression, he could regain a sense of control by deciding who lived and who died in the hospital. The killing spree finally began to unravel in 2003 at Somerset Medical Center in New Jersey. Charles had been working there for less than a year when patients began dying with alarming frequency. Father Florian Gall, a Roman Catholic priest recovering from pneumonia, died unexpectedly with sky-high levels of digoxin in his blood. It was the second unexplained digoxin overdose in 2 weeks. Dr. Stephen Marcus, director of New Jersey's Poison Control Center, was called in to consult on the strange deaths. When he saw the blood work, he immediately suspected foul play. The blood levels were astronomical, he said. They were way higher than you would ever shoot for by using the drug therapeutically. His immediate thought was that something malicious was happening at the hospital. Somerset administrators began an internal investigation and discovered that Charles was the common factor in multiple suspicious deaths. He was accessing drug dispensing systems for patients who weren't assigned to him, ordering medications that weren't prescribed, and his fingerprints were all over cases where patients died unexpectedly. When they confronted him about discrepancies in his job application, they fired him on October 31st, 2003. But instead of quietly letting him disappear like previous hospitals had done, Somerset contacted law enforcement. New Jersey State Police began investigating, and they quickly realized they were dealing with something far worse than isolated incidents. This was a serial killer who had been operating with virtual impunity for over a decade. The investigation might have stalled there, but Charles had made a crucial mistake. He had befriended Amy Lochran, a fellow nurse at Somerset who was dealing with her own health problems. Amy was a single mother struggling with a heart condition that threatened her ability to work. Charles had been kind to her, covering her shifts when she was sick, watching her children when she needed help. To Amy, Charles was a good friend and an excellent nurse. But when Amy started noticing the pattern of deaths that followed Charles from shift to shift, she began to have horrible suspicions. When police interviewed her as part of their investigation, she mentioned that one patient's death looked like an insulin overdose. As the investigation continued, Amy realized with growing horror that her friend, the man she trusted with her children, was likely a serial killer. Detectives asked Amy to wear a wire and meet with Charles to see if she could get him to confess. It was an incredibly dangerous request. They were asking her to confront a man who had killed dozens of people and might not hesitate to kill again if he felt cornered. But Amy agreed, knowing that her cooperation might be the only way to stop him. They met at a bar in Bridgewater, New Jersey, and Amy carefully steered the conversation toward the suspicious deaths at Somerset. Charles grew increasingly agitated as Amy pressed him about patients who had died on his watch. Finally, she confronted him directly. "I know you did it. Let's go to the police station. We can call them together." Charles's response was telling. I can't. He got up and left the bar, but police were waiting in the parking lot. The recording hadn't captured a full confession, but it provided enough probable cause for an arrest. On December 12th, 2003, Charles Cullen was finally taken into custody. Once in police custody, Charles began talking, not because he felt remorse, but because he seemed to relish the attention. He confessed to murdering approximately 40 patients, though investigators believe the real number could be as high as 400. He provided details about specific cases, drew maps of where bodies might be found, and walked detectives through his methods with chilling precision. Charles claimed he killed patients to end their suffering, but the evidence told a different story. Many of his victims weren't terminally ill. Some were young, healthy people who were expected to recover fully. The mercy narrative was just another way for Charles to avoid taking responsibility for what he really was: a predator who used his position of trust to satisfy his need for control and power. In court, families of his victims confronted the man who had stolen their loved ones. Mary Strenko, whose 21-year-old son Michael had been murdered by Charles, spoke about the devastating impact of his crimes. "My heart aches for my son," she said. "It bleeds for my son." She described how Charles had come to the waiting room after Michael's death, looking them in the eye and telling them how gravely ill Michael had been, as if he were delivering tragic news rather than admitting to murder. Charles was ultimately sentenced to 11 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He will never see freedom again, and he will die in prison. But the damage he caused extends far beyond the lives he took. Families were left to wonder if their loved ones' final moments were filled with terror, if they knew what was happening to them. The trust between patients and healthcare providers was shattered for countless people who learned that the person they thought was trying to save them might have been trying to kill them. Perhaps most disturbing of all is how easily Charles Cullen was able to operate for so long. He wasn't a criminal mastermind or a brilliant manipulator. He was a deeply troubled man with obvious red flags who should have been stopped years before he was. The healthcare system failed at every level. Hospitals that suspected him but didn't report him, regulatory agencies that didn't share information, and a culture that prioritized liability protection over patient safety. Charles Cullen represents the worst case scenario of institutional failure. He was hiding in plain sight, not because he was particularly clever, but because the system was designed to protect itself rather than the patients it served. His case led to reforms in how healthcare workers are monitored and how hospitals share information about problematic employees. But for the families of his victims, those changes came too late. Today, Charles Cullen sits in a maximum security prison in New Jersey, where he will remain until he dies. He rarely speaks to reporters or researchers, maintaining the same quiet, unremarkable demeanor that allowed him to kill with impunity for 16 years. In rare interviews, he still claims his murders were acts of mercy, still presents himself as a victim of circumstances rather than a predator who chose to kill. But the truth about Charles Cullen is simpler and more terrifying than his explanations suggest. He was a man who found power in death, who discovered that in a world where he felt powerless and insignificant, he could become God by deciding who lived and who died. His victims weren't mercy killings. They were human sacrifices to his own sense of powerlessness and rage. The story of Charles Cullen forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about trust, authority, and the systems we depend on for our safety. He wasn't a monster who emerged from the darkness. He was a monster who lived in the light, who smiled at patients' families while planning their loved ones' deaths, who used society's trust in healthcare workers to hide in plain sight. In the end, Charles Cullen may be one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, but he will never be as famous as Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer. There were no dramatic chases, no clever escapes, no theatrical confrontations. Just a quiet man in scrubs, moving through hospital corridors like death itself, claiming victim after victim while everyone around him looked the other way. His legacy isn't just the lives he took, but the trust he destroyed, the knowledge that evil doesn't always announce itself with violence and chaos. Sometimes it wears a stethoscope, carries a medical degree, and kills with the same hands that are supposed to heal. Sometimes the monsters are the ones we trust most, and they hide not in the darkness, but in the bright, sterile light of places where we go to be saved. In the summer of 1990, New York City was no stranger to violence. The crack epidemic was raging, crime statistics were soaring, and another shooting in Brooklyn barely registered as newsworthy. But when Mario Orozco limped home from his restaurant job at 3 a.m. on March 8th, using his wooden cane to navigate the deserted streets of East New York, he became the first victim of something far more sinister than the usual urban chaos. A figure in a maroon beret emerged from the shadows of a nearby cemetery. Without warning, without a word, he fired a single shot into Orozco's back with a homemade zip gun. As the 49-year-old father collapsed on the sidewalk, his attacker didn't flee immediately. Instead, he carefully placed his weapon next to the wounded man, along with a note that would chill investigators to the bone. This is the Zodiac. For a moment, the impossible seemed possible. Had the infamous Zodiac killer who had terrorized Northern California in the late 1960s and vanished without a trace, somehow resurfaced on the opposite coast after 20 years of silence? The answer would prove to be both more mundane and more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. The truth was that a 22-year-old nobody named Heriberto Eddie Seda had watched a PBS documentary about the original Zodiac killer and decided he wanted to be famous too. But Eddie wasn't content to simply copy someone else's crimes. He was going to improve on them, systematize them, and unlike his predecessor, he was going to finish what he started. Eddie Seda was born on July 31st, 1967, into a working-class Puerto Rican family in Brooklyn. His childhood was marked by the kind of urban poverty that breeds either resilience or rage. His father was absent, his mother worked multiple jobs to keep food on the table, and Eddie grew up in East New York, a neighborhood where gunshots were as common as sirens. But Eddie wasn't like the other kids who turned to drugs or gangs for escape. He was obsessed with order, with patterns, with meaning. He attended church regularly, quoted scripture, and called police to report drug dealers in his neighborhood. To his neighbors, he seemed like one of the good ones, a quiet, religious young man who kept to himself and stayed out of trouble. What they didn't know was that Eddie spent his days reading Soldier of Fortune magazine, studying books about serial killers, and meticulously crafting an arsenal of homemade weapons in his bedroom. He was particularly fascinated by Ted Bundy, but it was the Zodiac killer who captured his imagination completely. Here was a man who had killed at will, taunted police with cryptic letters, and disappeared into legend without ever being caught. Eddie kept detailed scrapbooks about the case, memorizing every detail of the crimes, the letters, and the investigation. But there was one crucial difference between Eddie and his idol. The original Zodiac's crimes seemed random, chaotic, without clear motive. Eddie was going to do better. He was going to create a system, a grand design that would make perfect sense once it was complete. He would kill 12 people, one for each sign of the Zodiac, in a methodical campaign that would cement his place in criminal history. In November 1989, Eddie sent his first letter to the 75th Precinct in Brooklyn. It contained a warning of 12 murders to come, along with a circle divided into sections representing the Zodiac signs. Police filed it away as the work of another crank. They had no idea they were looking at a blueprint for terror. Eddie's first attack on Mario Orozco was nearly perfect in its execution. The victim survived, but barely, and couldn't provide any description of his attacker. The note left at the scene suggested the work of the notorious Zodiac killer, but that seemed impossible. The California killer had been inactive for decades. 3 weeks later, Eddie struck again. Jermaine Montenegro was walking home from a late party in the Bronx when a figure emerged from the shadows and shot him in the back near a subway station. The bullet passed through his liver, critically wounding him, but like Orozco, Montenegro survived and never saw his attacker's face. 2 days later, Eddie achieved his first successful kill. Joseph Pross, a 78-year-old tourist, was standing on 87th Road in Woodhaven, Queens, when a bearded man approached and asked for $1. When Prost refused and began walking away, Eddie shot him in the back with his zip gun. This time, the victim didn't survive. The pattern was beginning to emerge, though police didn't recognize it yet. Eddie wasn't just shooting people at random, he was hunting specific zodiac signs. After each attack, he would search his victims' belongings for identification, checking their birth dates to confirm he had the right target. Each victim represented another sign crossed off his list, another step toward his ultimate goal of killing one person for each sign of the zodiac. Eddie's fourth victim was Larry Parham, a homeless man sleeping on a bench in Central Park. Eddie approached him in the early morning hours of June 19th, 1990, and asked him his zodiac sign. When Parham, a Cancer, answered truthfully, Eddie shot him in the chest with his zip gun. Miraculously, the bullet missed Parham's aorta, and he survived, but the symbolism wasn't lost on investigators who found another zodiac-themed note at the scene. By now, police were beginning to connect the dots. The attacks were clearly linked. Same type of weapon, same cryptic notes, same zodiac references. They created a task force called Operation Watchdog and began to seriously consider the possibility that the original Zodiac killer had relocated to New York. But Eddie had made a crucial mistake. Unlike the careful, enigmatic letters of the original Zodiac, Eddie's communications were crude and boastful. Handwriting analysis quickly ruled out any connection to the California killer. Whoever was doing this was a copycat, someone obsessed with the original case, but lacking the intelligence and sophistication to truly replicate it. Still, that didn't make Eddie any less dangerous. In fact, it made him more unpredictable. The original Zodiac had been methodical, but seemingly random. Eddie had a specific plan, a system he was determined to complete, no matter how many people had to die. Then, as suddenly as the attacks had begun, they stopped. After Larry Parham's shooting in June 1990, the Zodiac letters ceased and no more attacks occurred. Police began to hope that whoever was responsible had either moved on, been arrested for another crime, or simply lost interest. They were wrong. Eddie hadn't lost interest. He had just gone underground to plan his next phase. For 2 years, he studied, prepared, and refined his methods. He built more zip guns, experimented with different approaches, and waited for the right moment to resurface. That moment came on August 10th, 1992, when Eddie lured Patricia Fonte to the shore of Highland Park Reservoir with flirtatious advances. The 39-year-old Leo thought she was meeting someone for a romantic encounter. Instead, she found herself face to face with a madman who shot her twice with a zip gun. When the shots didn't kill her immediately, Fonte fought back with desperate fury. What happened next revealed the true depth of Eddie's darkness. Unable to finish her with the gun, he pulled out a knife and stabbed her over and over again, more than 100 times in total. The attack was so frenzied, so utterly savage, that it marked a clear escalation in Eddie's violence. He was no longer content with quick, efficient kills. He wanted his victims to suffer. The second phase of Eddie's campaign was more aggressive, more personal than the first. On June 4th, 1993, he shot James Weber, a 40-year-old Libra, in the buttocks as Weber walked through Highland Park. Weber survived, as did Diane Ballard, a 40-year-old Taurus who was shot and left partially paralyzed on October 2nd, 1993. But not all of Eddie's victims were so fortunate. On July 20th, in 1993, he crept up on John Diacone, a homeless Virgo, and shot him point blank in the neck with a zip gun. Diacon died instantly, becoming Eddie's third confirmed kill. By now, the NYPD knew they were dealing with a serial killer, but they were no closer to catching him. Eddie was careful, methodical, and completely unpredictable in his timing. He could strike anywhere in the city, at any time, and his homemade weapons left no ballistic signature that could be traced. What police didn't know was that Eddie had come dangerously close to being caught in March 1994. He was arrested for possession of a deadly weapon after police noticed a suspicious bulge in his jacket that concealed one of his zip guns. But when authorities determined the weapon wasn't functional, his public defender got all charges dropped and his arrest record sealed. To Eddie, this wasn't just good fortune, it was divine intervention. He had always believed that his mission was guided by God, that he was doing righteous work by eliminating evil people from the world. His narrow escape from prosecution only confirmed his belief that he was protected, untouchable, destined to complete his 12-kill Zodiac wheel. But Eddie's hubris would ultimately prove to be his downfall. On June 18th, 1996, he got into an argument with his half-sister Gladys Chachi Reyes over her new boyfriend, whom Eddie believed to be a drug dealer. Eddie had always been obsessed with maintaining moral purity in his household, and he couldn't tolerate what he saw as his sister's association with criminal elements. The argument escalated quickly. Eddie pulled out one of his zip guns and began firing wildly around the apartment. When Gladys tried to flee, he shot her in the back. She managed to escape to a neighbor's apartment and call police, but her boyfriend was trapped inside with an increasingly unstable Eddie. When police arrived, Eddie opened fire from his third-floor window, beginning a tense standoff that would last for hours. Hostage negotiator Joe Herbert, who had been working the Zodiac case for years, was called to the scene to talk Eddie down. After 3 hours of negotiation, Eddie finally agreed to surrender. Police lowered a bucket from the roof and instructed him to place all his weapons inside. To their amazement, Eddie produced more than a dozen homemade zip guns, along with pipe bombs and materials to make more weapons. Eddie was arrested on domestic violence charges, but Detective Herbert suspected there might be more to the story. When Eddie was asked to provide a written statement about the incident, he readily complied. At the bottom of his confession, he signed his name along with a peculiar symbol, a crosshair with 3 sevens around it. Herbert's blood ran cold. He had seen that exact symbol countless times over the past 6 years, in the letters and notes left by the elusive New York Zodiac killer. After all these years of investigation, the breakthrough had come not from brilliant detective work or advanced forensics, but from Eddie's own compulsive need to leave his signature. Fingerprint analysis quickly confirmed what Herbert suspected. Eddie's prints matched those found on Zodiac letters and at crime scenes. DNA from saliva on letter stamps provided additional confirmation. After 6 years of terrorizing New York City, the New York Zodiac killer had finally been unmasked. Under interrogation, Eddie confessed to all the attacks, though his explanations were rambling and often incoherent. When asked why he chose his victims, he could only say that he got a feeling about them, that they were evil people who needed to be eliminated. He claimed to be doing God's work, cleaning up the streets and protecting the innocent. But investigators found no evidence that Eddie's victims were anything other than ordinary people in the wrong place at the wrong time. Mario Orozco was a hard-working father trying to support his family. Joseph Pros was an elderly man who had the misfortune to refuse a panhandler's request for money. Patricia Fonte was a woman looking for companionship who instead found a monster. The truth was simpler and more chilling than Eddie's grandiose rationalizations. He had killed these people not because they were evil, but because their birthdays aligned with his obsessive need to complete his zodiac wheel. They died not for anything they had done, but for when they were born. In two separate trials in 1998, Eddie was convicted of 3 murders and multiple attempted murders. He was sentenced to a total of 232 years in prison, effectively ensuring he would never see freedom again. At sentencing, he showed no remorse, no understanding of the pain he had caused. He disrupted proceedings with outbursts and continued to insist that he had been doing righteous work. Today, at 56 years old, Eddie Seda sits in Clinton Correctional Facility in upstate New York, where he will remain until he dies. He spends his days reading the Bible, quoting scripture to other inmates, and folding origami animals. He has never expressed genuine remorse for his crimes, continuing to believe that his victims deserved their fate. In a strange twist of irony, the man who killed for zodiac signs claims to know nothing about astrology. When asked about his knowledge of the zodiac in a 2004 interview, he simply said, "I got nothing to live for. I don't got no job. I already got those skills. I could be famous. I could do that." Fame, that was what it had all been about. Not divine mission, not moral cleansing, not even the thrill of killing. Eddie Seda murdered 3 innocent people and traumatized countless others because he wanted to be remembered, to matter, to be more than just another unemployed nobody living in his mother's apartment. In that goal, at least, he succeeded. But the fame he achieved was not the legendary status of his idol, the mysterious Zodiac killer who vanished into myth. Instead, Eddie Seda became something much more pathetic, a failed copycat whose incompetence led to his capture and whose motives were revealed to be banal and selfish. The surviving victims of Eddie's attacks still bear the physical and psychological scars of their encounters with him. Some, like the deeply religious Larry Parham, have found it in their hearts to forgive their attacker. Others prefer not to discuss the case at all, trying to move forward with their lives without being defined by the moment a stranger decided they should die. Eddie's case serves as a stark reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with grand manifestos or obvious warning signs. Sometimes it lurks in the most ordinary places, in the quiet young man who goes to church every Sunday, who calls police on drug dealers, who seems like one of the good ones. Sometimes the monsters aren't born in darkness, but in the desperate need to matter, to be special, to escape the crushing anonymity of ordinary life. In the end, Eddie Seda got exactly what he wanted. He became famous. But fame is a double-edged sword, and the legacy he created is not one of criminal genius or mystique, but of petty narcissism and senseless violence. He will be remembered not as the Zodiac killer he tried to become, but as the pathetic wannabe who threw away his life and the lives of others for a fleeting moment in the spotlight. The original Zodiac killer achieved immortality through mystery, vanishing into legend before he could be caught and diminished by exposure. Eddie Seda achieved infamy through failure, his every weakness and delusion laid bare for the world to see. In his desperate attempt to become legendary, he became merely cautionary, a warning about the dangerous intersection of mental illness, obsession, and the modern hunger for fame at any cost. On a cold December morning in 2010, a police officer and his dog were searching through the thick underbrush along Ocean Parkway in Long Island, looking for a missing woman who had vanished 8 months earlier. But what they found instead would uncover one of the most chilling serial killing sprees in American history. Hidden in the marsh grass, wrapped in burlap like discarded cargo, was the first body, then another, then another. By the end of that day, 4 women had been discovered, all murdered, all discarded like trash along this desolate stretch of highway. The search that began looking for one missing person had uncovered a graveyard. What no one knew that December morning was that the man responsible for these deaths had been living among them for decades. He was a neighbor, a father, an architect who commuted to Manhattan every day. He was hiding in plain sight, and he would continue killing for another 13 years before anyone suspected the truth. Rex Hoyerman was born in 1963 and raised in Massapequa Park, Long Island, in the very house where he would eventually plan his murders. He wasn't born into poverty or abuse, the usual breeding grounds for monsters. He had a middle-class upbringing, went to local schools, and then even graduated alongside future actor Billy Baldwin from Berner High School in 1981. By all accounts, Hoyerman appeared to be living the American dream. He earned his architecture degree from the New York Institute of Technology and founded his own consulting firm, RH Consultants and Associates, in Manhattan in 1994. His clients included major corporations like Target, Foot Locker, and American Airlines. He married Asa Ellerup in 1996, became stepfather to her son Christopher, and had a daughter, Victoria. They lived in his childhood home, a modest house that would later become the center of a horrific investigation. But beneath this veneer of suburban normalcy, something dark was festering. Hoyerman had chronic financial problems, owing hundreds of thousands of dollars in unpaid taxes to the IRS, with 6 tax liens filed against him between 2010 and 2021. He was also litigious and paranoid, frequently filing lawsuits claiming he'd been injured in car accidents. Those who worked with him began to notice unsettling behavior. A former employee named Muriel Henriquez remembered how he once tracked her down on a cruise ship during her vacation, slipping a note under her door that read, "I told you I could find you anywhere." Another colleague recalled how he kept hunting photos in his office and had an obsession with control that made people uncomfortable. But what they didn't know was that Hoyerman had been living a double life. While he appeared to be a devoted family man by day, by night he was prowling the streets of Manhattan and Long Island, hunting for victims. The killings began in 1993, though police wouldn't connect them for decades. Hoyerman's method was calculated and cruel. He targeted women who worked as escorts, often advertising their services on Craigslist. These were women who lived on society's margins, women whose disappearances might not be immediately noticed or taken seriously by authorities. Hoyerman used burner phones to contact his victims, discarding them shortly after each murder to avoid detection. He would arrange meetings in Manhattan, where he worked, or in areas close to his Long Island home. The sophistication of his approach was chilling. He wasn't acting on impulse, but following a methodical plan that he had refined over years. What made Hoyerman particularly dangerous was his intelligence and his intimate knowledge of Long Island. As investigators would later note, he was very familiar with the South Shore of Long Island and knew exactly where to dispose of bodies to avoid detection. Ocean Parkway, where most of the bodies were found, was a perfect dumping ground, isolated, marshy, and rarely patrolled. The four women whose bodies were discovered in December 2010 became known as the Gilgo Four: Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, and Amber Lynn Costello. Each had been murdered between 2007 and 2010, and each told a story of a life cut tragically short. Melissa Barthelemy was just 24 when she vanished in July 2009. She had moved to New York from Buffalo, hoping to start a new life. After her disappearance, someone using her phone made taunting calls to her younger sister, saying cruel things about Melissa being a prostitute. These calls would later be traced to areas around Hoyerman's home and workplace. Megan Waterman was 22, a mother from Maine who had traveled to New York to work as an escort. She disappeared from a hotel in Hauppauge in June 2010. Her phone last connected to a cell tower in Massapequa Park, just minutes from where Hoyerman lived. Maureen Brainerd Barnes, 25, vanished from Manhattan in July 2007. She was last seen near Penn Station, just blocks from Hoyerman's office. Amber Lynn Costello, 27, disappeared from West Babylon in September 2010, making her likely Hoyerman's final victim in this initial killing spree. All four women had been wrapped in burlap sacks, a signature that would become central to the investigation. The care with which their bodies had been arranged and bound suggested a killer who took time with his victims, who found some sick satisfaction in the ritual of death. As the investigation continued, more bodies were discovered. By May 2011, police had found 10 sets of remains along Ocean Parkway and the surrounding areas. The additional victims included Jessica Taylor, whose dismembered remains were found in 2 separate locations in 2003 and 2011, and Valerie Mack, whose body was discovered in 2000 and whose other remains weren't found until 2011. Most disturbing was the discovery of a toddler's remains, later identified as 2-year-old Tatiana Marie Dykes, found alongside her mother, Tanya Denise Jackson. The presence of a child among the victims added another layer of horror to an already incomprehensible crime spree. What investigators would later discover was even more chilling. In Hoyerman's possession was a detailed planning document, a Microsoft Word file that served as a checklist for murder. The document included sections labeled supplies, with items like rope mage cord and saw cutting tools, a DS section believed to stand for dump site, and most horrifically, a body prep section with notes to remove head and hands. There were notes for improvement, referencing next time and considering different methods of killing and mutilation. It read like a business plan, but the business was murder. For over a decade, the Long Island serial killer remained a ghost. The case went through 5 police commissioners and generated over 1,000 tips, but investigators seemed no closer to finding the perpetrator. There were even doubts about whether a serial killer existed at all, or if the deaths were unconnected incidents. Everything changed in January 2022 when the Suffolk County District Attorney convened a new task force specifically to investigate the Gilgo Beach killings. Using advanced DNA analysis and new investigative techniques, they began to close in on their target. The breakthrough came when surveillance teams observed Hoyerman disposing of a pizza crust in a Manhattan trash can. DNA from that crust matched genetic material found on the victims. Additional evidence came from bottles that Hoyerman's family had thrown away, which contained DNA matching hair found on the victims. Even more damning was the discovery that Hoyerman owned a Chevrolet Avalanche that had been spotted near where one of his victims was last seen. Cell phone data showed his movements corresponded with the times and locations of the murders, and investigators observed him adding minutes to burner phones, behavior that matched the pattern used in the crimes. On July 13th, 2023, Rex Hoyerman was arrested as he walked down a busy Manhattan street after work, apparently unaware that he was being followed. During his arraignment, Suffolk County Police Commissioner Rodney Harrison didn't mince words. Rex Hoyerman is a demon that walks amongst us, a predator that ruined families. The psychological profile that investigators had developed in 2011 proved to be eerily accurate. They had predicted the killer would be a white male in his mid-20s to mid-40s, educated, financially secure, and familiar with Long Island. They said he would likely be married, drive an expensive vehicle, and appear unassuming to most people. Hoyerman matched this profile almost perfectly. Investigators also discovered the depth of Hoyerman's obsession with his crimes. He had made thousands of Google searches related to the Gilgo Beach investigation and serial killers in general, looking up items like 11 currently active serial killers and 8 terrifying active serial killers we can't find. In searches of his home and office, authorities found old magazines and newspapers with articles about the Gilgo Beach killings that prosecutors believe he kept as souvenirs or mementos. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery of how Hoyerman had manipulated those closest to him. His wife Asa and their children were out of state during each of the murders, suggesting that Hoyerman carefully planned his killings around their absence. Hair belonging to his wife was found on or near 3 of the victims, transferred through close contact with Hoyerman, making her an unwitting accomplice to his crimes. The family was devastated by the revelations. Asa filed for divorce the same month as his arrest, ending their 27-year marriage. According to her attorney, she had a very difficult time believing that the Rex, who she was married to for 27 years, is capable of committing these homicides. As of December 2024, Hoyerman has been charged with 7 murders spanning from 1993 to 2010. At each court appearance, he has maintained his innocence, telling the judge, "Your Honor, I am not guilty of any of these charges." But investigators believe there may be more victims. The case has opened new lines of inquiry, and many families of missing women are hoping their loved ones might finally be identified among the remains. The investigation has also exposed decades of corruption and mismanagement in the Suffolk County Police Department that may have allowed Hoyerman to continue killing for so long. The story of Rex Hoyerman forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about the nature of evil. This wasn't a monster lurking in shadows or living on society's fringes. This was a man who coached his daughter's soccer team, who fixed his neighbor's computers, who smiled and waved as he left for work each morning in Manhattan. As one criminologist noted in 2011, this is someone who can walk into a room and seem like your average Joe. He has to be persuasive enough and rational enough that he is able to convince these women to meet him. That description proved to be prophetic. For over 3 decades, Rex Hoyerman lived among the families of Long Island, many of whom had no idea that the monster they feared was living right next door. He attended the same schools, shopped at the same stores, and walked the same streets as his victims and their families. He was, in every sense, hiding in plain sight. The case serves as a stark reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with warning signs or dramatic reveals. Sometimes it wears the mask of respectability, carries a briefcase to work, and comes home to dinner with the family. Sometimes the monster next door is just that, the man next door. And perhaps most terrifying of all, if Rex Hoyerman could evade detection for over 30 years while living an apparently normal life, how many other monsters are walking among us, waiting for the right moment to reveal their true nature? The Long Island serial killer case doesn't just tell us about one man's descent into darkness. It forces us to question how well we really know the people around us and whether we can ever truly be safe from the evil that hides behind ordinary faces. In the suffocating summer heat of 1911 Atlanta, where the air hung thick with humidity and racial tension, a young woman named Emma Lou Sharp made a discovery that would reveal one of America's earliest and most brutal serial killers. It was a Saturday evening in July when 20-year-old Emma Lou sat in her modest home on Hanover Street, watching shadows creep across the floorboards as her mother failed to return from what should have been a simple trip to the market. Emma Lou's worry wasn't just that of a concerned daughter. These were dangerous times for Black women in Atlanta. Just weeks earlier, their neighbor Addie Watts had been found with her skull crushed by a brick, her body dragged into bushes where her throat was slashed so deep it nearly severed her head. It was the latest in a string of murders that had the city's African American community barricading themselves indoors after dark. When Emma Lou finally ventured out to search for her mother, she stumbled upon a scene of unimaginable horror. Near the railroad tracks, she found her mother Lena's mutilated body, throat cut from ear to ear in a jagged, deliberate wound. But the nightmare wasn't over. A tall figure emerged from the darkness, well-dressed and moving with terrifying calm. He slashed at Emma Lou with his blade, leaving her wounded but alive, before disappearing into the night like smoke. What Emma Lou had encountered was a predator who would haunt Atlanta for years, claiming at least 20 victims in a reign of terror that paralleled London's Jack the Ripper. But this killer operated in the racially charged atmosphere of the American South, targeting young Black women whose deaths were systematically ignored by white authorities and the press until the mounting body count became impossible to dismiss. Atlanta in 1911 was a city caught between two worlds. The so called New South was trying to shed its reputation for racial violence, courting Northern investment, and promoting itself as a modern progressive metropolis. But beneath this veneer of respectability, the city remained a powder keg of racial tension, still reeling from the devastating race riot of 1906 that had left dozens dead and hundreds injured. It was into this atmosphere of fear and prejudice that the Atlanta Ripper emerged, finding in the city's marginalized black community the perfect hunting ground. His victims were young women, typically in their early 20s, described by newspapers as good looking and neatly dressed. Many were educated, working as domestic servants in white households or as laundresses and cooks. They were women who had to walk the dark streets alone, traveling to and from work in an era when few could afford the luxury of safety. The killer showed a disturbing level of calculation in his choice of victims and locations. He struck primarily on Saturday nights, when the streets were busiest, but also when his crimes might be attributed to the chaos of weekend revelry. His victims were found near railroad tracks, in vacant lots, or in the shadows between buildings where their bodies might lie undiscovered for hours or even days. What made the Atlanta Ripper particularly terrifying was his method. Unlike many serial killers who develop a signature over time, he seemed to perfect his technique from the very beginning. His victims were typically struck on the head with a blunt object, a brick, a coupling pin from the railroad, or sometimes an axe. Then, while they lay dying or unconscious, he would slash their throats with surgical precision. The wounds were described as deliberate and methodical, suggesting someone who took time to ensure his victims suffered. The first confirmed killing occurred on May 28, 1911, when Belle Walker, a cook, was found dead 25 yards from her home on Garibaldi Street. The Atlanta Constitution buried the story on page 7 under the dismissive headline, "Negro Woman Killed, No Clue to Slayer." The brief two-paragraph report noted that Walker's throat had been cut and that she had failed to return from work the previous night, but there was no sense of urgency, no call for investigation. This pattern of indifference would continue for months. When Rosa Rivers was found shot to death on May 8th, authorities didn't connect her murder to what would later be recognized as the Ripper's killing spree. When an unidentified woman was discovered with her skull crushed near the West Point Belt car line in February, she merited barely a mention in the press. The systematic devaluation of black lives in early 20th century Atlanta created the perfect cover for a serial killer to operate with virtual impunity. The murders continued with methodical regularity. Addie Watts in June, her head smashed with a brick before her throat was cut. Lizzie Watts later that month was dragged into bushes and mutilated. Each crime bore the hallmarks of the same killer, yet authorities seemed incapable of connecting the dots. The black community lived in terror, but their fears were dismissed by white police as hysteria or superstition. It wasn't until the brutal murder of Sadie Hawley on July 11th, 1911, that the killings finally made the front page of the Atlanta Constitution. Hawley, a laundry worker, was found nearly decapitated with a large fracture to her skull. The savage nature of her death, combined with the growing body count, finally forced the white press to acknowledge what the black community had known for months: A serial killer was stalking Atlanta's streets. The newspapers began drawing comparisons to London's Jack the Ripper, noting the similar methods and the precision of the throat wounds. The Atlanta Journal wrote of a black butcher running rampant in the city, while other papers speculated about a killer with anatomical knowledge based on the surgical precision of the cuts. By late 1911, the pattern was undeniable. The victims were all young black women, all murdered in the same horrific manner, all found in similar locations. They were often discovered near railroad tracks, suggesting the killer used the rail system to move through the city and dispose of bodies. Some victims showed signs of having been moved after death, indicating the killer had a vehicle or means of transportation. The timing was also significant. Most murders occurred on Saturday nights, when the killer could move through the city's entertainment districts without attracting attention. This suggested someone familiar with Atlanta's rhythms, someone who understood when and where he could strike without being seen. The Atlanta Police Department's response to the killings was characterized by incompetence and racial prejudice. White detectives showed little interest in investigating crimes against black victims, often attributing the murders to domestic disputes or the supposed inherent violence of the black community. When they did make arrests, it was often based on the flimsiest of evidence or outright racial profiling. Henry Huff became the first serious suspect when he was found with blood on his trousers and scratches on his arms after being seen arguing with victim Sadie Holly. But even after he was arrested and indicted, the killings continued, clearly indicating his innocence. He was eventually acquitted, but not before spending months in jail. Other suspects included Henderson, who was arrested simply for being a black man found with a razor after one of the murders. The police's investigative methods were so poor that they often arrested multiple suspects for the same crime, sometimes holding them simultaneously while trying to decide which one to charge. The most promising lead came when authorities arrested Lawton Brown in August 1912. Brown initially confessed to killing Eva Florence, and investigators believed he might be responsible for multiple murders. His wife reported seeing him come home with blood on his clothes on Saturdays when murders occurred, but Brown later recanted his confession, claiming he had been beaten into admitting guilt. He too was eventually acquitted when the evidence against him proved insufficient. Emma Lou Sharp remained the only person to see the Atlanta Ripper and survive. Her description of the killer provided the most detailed information police ever obtained. She described him as a black man, either tall or slender, with a strong build and well-dressed appearance, complete with a wide-brimmed hat. Her account suggested someone who was not a vagrant or street criminal, but rather a person of some means and social standing. Emma Lou's survival may have been deliberate. The killer had shown no mercy to any of his other victims, yet he left her alive, despite having the opportunity to finish what he started. Some investigators theorized that he was interrupted or that her youth made him hesitate. Others suggested he may have wanted a witness, someone to spread fear and confirm his presence in the community. The psychological profile that emerged from Emma Lou's testimony and the crime scenes painted a picture of a methodical, intelligent killer. He was organized enough to avoid capture for years, sophisticated enough to choose victims and locations that minimized his risk of detection, and cruel enough to torture his victims before killing them. The precision of his throat cuts suggested possible medical knowledge or butchering experience. As word of the murders spread through Atlanta's black community, women began changing their behavior. Many refused to work late shifts or walk home alone after dark. Some moved back in with family members or arranged to travel in groups. The Baltimore Sun reported that few black women could be seen on the streets at night, and black service workers were refusing jobs that required them to be out after dark. The economic impact was significant. White employers complained that their domestic help was becoming unreliable, refusing to work evening hours or demanding transportation home. Some families lost their primary breadwinners when women quit jobs they could no longer safely perform. Churches became centers of community organizing, with pastors like Reverend Henry Proctor encouraging parishioners to come forward with information. They also pressured police to assign black detectives to the case, arguing that witnesses would be more likely to trust officers who looked like them and understood their experiences. The Atlanta Ripper's reign of terror created a disturbing copycat effect. The case files from this period reveal several domestic murders where husbands or boyfriends killed their partners and attempted to make the crimes look like Ripper attacks. The prevalence of throat-slashing murders created a convenient cover for other killers, making it even more difficult for police to determine which crimes were actually connected to the serial killer. One such case involved Frank Harvey, who was suspected of killing Pearl Williams after allegedly telling her that if he couldn't marry her, no one else would. The murder bore some superficial similarities to the Ripper killings, but investigators eventually concluded it was a domestic crime rather than the work of the serial killer. The Atlanta Ripper's final confirmed victim was Laura Blackwell in 1917. Her murder showed an evolution in the killer's methods. In addition to the usual bludgeoning and throat slashing, her clothes were burned after death. This post-mortem burning became the signature that linked several late murders to a single perpetrator, possibly a different killer entirely, or an evolution in the original Ripper's methodology. John Brown was eventually convicted of Laura Blackwell's murder and is suspected of killing 3 other women whose remains or clothing were burned. But whether Brown was the original Atlanta Ripper or simply a copycat remains unclear. The burning of evidence suggests a more sophisticated understanding of police procedure, indicating either an evolution in the killer's methods or the emergence of a new perpetrator. By 1915, the murders had largely stopped, though sporadic killings with similar methods continued into the 1920s. The official investigation never concluded, and no one was ever definitively identified as the Atlanta Ripper. The case files, what remain of them, are fragmentary and incomplete, reflecting both the poor investigative practices of the era and the systematic devaluation of black lives. Modern criminologists who have studied the case believe the Atlanta Ripper was likely responsible for between 15 and 21 murders, making him one of the most prolific serial killers of the early 20th century. The lack of forensic evidence and the degraded state of police records make it impossible to know the exact number of victims or to definitively identify the killer. The Atlanta Ripper case represents more than just an unsolved serial killing spree. It serves as a stark reminder of how societal prejudice can enable violent predators and deny justice to vulnerable populations. The systematic dismissal of the victim's humanity, the incompetent police investigation, and the media's initial indifference all contributed to the killer's ability to operate with impunity for years. The case also highlights the resilience of Atlanta's black community during one of the most dangerous periods in the city's history. Despite living under constant threat, families continued to work, to build lives, and to demand justice for their murdered daughters, sisters, and mothers. Their persistence eventually forced authorities to acknowledge the reality of the crimes, even if it never led to the killer's capture. It's more than a century later, the Atlanta Ripper remains a phantom figure in criminal history. Was he a single killer, responsible for all the murders, or were there multiple perpetrators operating with similar methods? Did he have medical training that allowed him to make such precise cuts? Was he a member of Atlanta's black community, as Emma Lou's description suggests, or was he a white man disguising himself to deflect suspicion? The most disturbing question may be how many other similar killers operated in the early 20th century South, targeting marginalized communities whose deaths went unnoticed and uninvestigated. The Atlanta Ripper may not have been unique, but rather representative of a broader pattern of violence that has been erased from historical memory. The Atlanta Ripper's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, race, and the value society places on certain lives. His victims were not random strangers, but daughters, mothers, and sisters whose deaths devastated families and communities. They were young women with dreams and aspirations, cut down by a predator who knew that society's indifference would shield him from consequences. In the end, the Atlanta Ripper succeeded not just in taking lives, but in exposing the moral failures of the society that enabled him. His crimes reveal how prejudice and indifference can create the perfect conditions for evil to flourish, and how the pursuit of justice depends not just on capable investigators, but on a society that values all lives equally. The killer may have vanished into history, but his victims deserve to be remembered. They were more than just statistics in a criminal case. They were human beings whose lives mattered, whose deaths demand justice, and whose stories remind us that some evils can only thrive in the shadows of society's willful blindness. The Atlanta Ripper remains free, not because he was particularly clever, but because the world he inhabited had already decided his victims didn't matter enough to catch him. In the sprawling concrete labyrinth of Sao Paulo, Brazil, where towering skyscrapers cast long shadows over forgotten neighborhoods, a darkness was stirring that would soon grip the city in terror. It was 2007, and in the quiet suburb of Carapicuíba, there existed a small park called Pateras Park, a place where people seeking connection could find brief moments of refuge from a world that often rejected them. But what was meant to be a sanctuary would soon become a hunting ground for one of Brazil's most chilling and overlooked serial killers. His name remains unknown to this day. The media dubbed him the Rainbow Maniac, a moniker that sounds almost innocent until you understand the horror it represents. For over 2 years, this predator stalked the LGBT community of Sao Paulo with methodical precision, claiming at least 13 lives in a reign of terror that revealed the darkest corners of human hatred. The first body was discovered on July 4th, 2007, on what should have been a day of celebration. A man was found, shot in the head, his body discarded like refuse among the trees of Paturas Park. The victim was gay, but in a city where violence was commonplace, one murder didn't raise immediate alarm. The police marked it down as another isolated incident, another statistic in a city drowning in crime. But this wasn't isolated. This was just the beginning. Over the following months, more bodies began appearing in the same location. Each victim shared disturbing similarities. They were gay men, most found with their pants around their ankles, all shot execution style in the head. The killer showed no mercy, no hesitation. He would approach his victims in the dark corners of the park, where men sought connection and intimacy away from judging eyes, and he would end their lives with cold calculation. What made the Rainbow Maniac particularly terrifying wasn't just his methodology, but his complete invisibility. Unlike the flamboyant killers who sought attention and notoriety, this predator operated in absolute silence. He left no calling cards, no messages, no clues about his identity or motivation. He simply appeared, killed, and vanished back into the sprawling anonymity of Sao Paulo. The park itself became a character in this horror story. Paturas Park was a small green space tucked away in Carapicuíba, a working-class suburb where people minded their own business and asked few questions. For the local gay community, it had become an informal meeting place, a rare spot where they could be themselves without fear of harassment or violence. The irony was devastating. In seeking refuge from societal hostility, they had unknowingly entered the domain of something far more dangerous. As the body count rose, a pattern emerged that chilled investigators to the bone. The killer wasn't choosing victims randomly. He was specifically targeting gay men, hunting them with the patience of a predator who knew his prey's habits intimately. He understood when they came to the park, where they gathered, how they moved through the shadows. This wasn't opportunistic violence. This was calculated genocide. By early 2008, fear had begun to spread through São Paulo's LGBT community like wildfire. Word traveled through bars, clubs, and community centers that someone was hunting them. Men who had once found solace in Paturas Park now avoided it entirely, but the killer seemed undeterred. If his usual hunting ground was becoming scarce, he would adapt. The murders continued with horrifying regularity. Some victims were shot once, cleanly, as if the killer wanted to make their deaths quick. Others suffered multiple gunshot wounds, suggesting moments when his control slipped, when whatever rage drove him demanded more violent expression. One victim was found beaten to death rather than shot, a deviation that suggested the killer was either interrupted or had chosen to kill with his hands for reasons only he understood. What emerged from the crime scenes was a portrait of a methodical killer who took no trophies, left no evidence, and appeared to derive satisfaction purely from the act of elimination. Unlike serial killers who sexualized their crimes or sought to exert power over their victims, the Rainbow Maniac seemed motivated by something far simpler and more chilling, pure hatred. The investigation that followed revealed disturbing truths about Brazilian society, even in progressive São Paulo. Despite Brazil's relatively liberal attitudes toward LGBT rights, the country had legalized same-sex marriage since 2013 and was among the first to provide free HIV treatment. There remained deep pockets of homophobic violence. The rainbow maniac emerged from this contradiction, embodying the gap between legal progress and social acceptance. Detectives working the case faced numerous challenges. The victims were often estranged from their families, making identification difficult. Many lived on the margins of society, working in sex trade or struggling with addiction, factors that made them easy targets for a predator who understood that their disappearances might go unnoticed for days or weeks. The break in the case came from an unexpected source. On August 19th, 2008, a witness claimed to have seen something that would change everything. According to their testimony, they watched as a man approached a victim in Paturas Park and shot him 12 times at close range. The witness described the killer as calm, methodical, showing no emotion as he emptied his weapon into the defenseless man. This witness description led police to focus on a suspect that seemed almost too obvious to be real Jairo Francisco Franco, a retired state police sergeant. Franco fit the profile in disturbing ways. He had access to weapons, knowledge of police procedures, and the tactical training to avoid detection. When questioned, Franco's behavior raised red flags with investigators. But here's where the story takes a turn that epitomizes the failures of justice that often surround cases targeting marginalized communities. Despite witness testimony placing Franco at the scene of a murder, despite the pattern of violence that matched his capabilities, despite the obvious connection between his background and the killer's methods, Franco was acquitted by a jury in 2011. The acquittal sent shockwaves through Brazil's LGBT community. Many believed that Franco's status as a former police officer had protected him, that the same system meant to protect citizens had instead shielded one of their own. Others suspected that homophobic attitudes among the jurors had influenced their decision, that the victim's sexual orientation had somehow made their murders less worthy of justice. What's most disturbing about the Rainbow Maniac case isn't just the murders themselves, but what they represent about the vulnerability of marginalized communities to violence. The killer understood that he could target gay men with relative impunity, that their deaths would be investigated less thoroughly, that society's indifference would provide him cover for his crimes. The psychological profile that emerges from the Rainbow Maniac's crimes suggests a killer driven by ideological hatred rather than personal gratification. Unlike serial killers who develop relationships with their victims or derive sexual pleasure from violence, this predator seemed motivated by a simple belief that his victims deserved to die because of who they were. It's a form of violence that transforms murder into what the killer perceives as a public service. Even more chilling is the possibility that the Rainbow Maniac was never caught. If Franco was indeed innocent, then the real killer may still be out there, his identity protected by the passage of time and the failures of the initial investigation. The case officially remains unsolved, a fact that continues to haunt São Paulo's LGBT community. Today, Paturas Park still exists, though it bears invisible scars from the horrors that unfolded there. The murders have become a cautionary tale within Brazil's LGBT community, a reminder that progress in legal rights doesn't automatically translate to physical safety. The Rainbow Maniac succeeded in creating lasting fear, in transforming a place of refuge into a symbol of vulnerability. What makes this case particularly heartbreaking is how it reveals the isolation that many victims experienced in life and death. These were men seeking connection, intimacy, and acceptance in a world that often denied them all three. They found instead a predator who exploited their vulnerability, who turned their search for human contact into an opportunity for violence. The rainbow maniac represents something more sinister than individual pathology. He embodies a systematic hatred given human form. His crimes weren't random acts of violence, but calculated attacks on an entire community, designed to spread fear and reinforce marginalization. In this way, he succeeded beyond his individual murders, creating a legacy of terror that outlasted his active period. The failure to bring the rainbow maniac to justice represents more than investigative incompetence. It reflects broader societal failures to protect vulnerable populations. When marginalized communities become targets for systematic violence, and when that violence goes unpunished, it sends a message that some lives matter less than others. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Rainbow Maniac case is how easily it could happen again. The conditions that enabled his crimes, systematic marginalization, police indifference, and societal prejudice, still exist in many places around the world. His story serves as a warning about what happens when hatred finds expression through violence, and when society fails to respond with appropriate justice. The 13 confirmed victims of the Rainbow Maniac were more than statistics in a case file. They were individuals with dreams, fears, relationships, and stories that were cut short by someone who saw them only as targets. Their names may not be widely remembered, but their deaths revealed truths about Brazilian society that continue to resonate today. In the end, the Rainbow Maniac remains what he always was, a ghost haunting the margins of society, a reminder that even in progressive cities like Sao Paulo, darkness can flourish when it targets those society considers disposable. His crimes stand as testament to the reality that legal equality means nothing without genuine social acceptance, and that true progress requires more than laws. It requires a fundamental change in how we value human life. The story of the Rainbow Maniac isn't just about one killer's reign of terror. It's about the vulnerability of communities that society pushes to the margins, about the price of hatred when it finds expression through violence, and about the lasting trauma that occurs when justice fails those who need it most. Most of all, it's a reminder that the monsters we should fear most aren't the fictional ones that haunt our imaginations, but the real ones who walk among us, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. In the hot, sticky summer of 1986, Milwaukee's North Side began to bleed, but not in the way you might expect. This wasn't the quick violence of street crime or the explosive rage of domestic disputes. This was something else entirely, something methodical, something patient, something that would stalk the forgotten corners of Wisconsin's largest city for over 2 decades. His name was Walter Ellis, and for 21 years he existed in the shadows between two worlds. To his neighbors, he was the quiet man next door who fixed cars and kept to himself. But in the darkness of Milwaukee's underbelly, he was something far more terrifying, a predator who understood that the best hunting grounds are the places society refuses to look. Walter Earl Ellis was born on June 24th, 1960, in Holmes County, Mississippi, into a world that seemed designed to break him. He was one of 6 children born to Leroy and Mattie Ellis, a family struggling to survive in the Deep South during one of America's most turbulent decades. When Walter was just 5 years old, his family packed their meager belongings and joined the Great Migration North, settling in Milwaukee's North Side in search of opportunities that Mississippi couldn't provide. But opportunity and hope were two different things. In Milwaukee, young Walter found neither. From the very beginning, something was wrong. While other children played and laughed, Walter seethed. By age 7, he was already earning a reputation as the neighborhood bully, his fits of rage and physical violence setting him apart from his peers. Teachers noted his antisocial behavior, his inability to form meaningful connections, and his frightening capacity for sudden explosive aggression. He would assault classmates without provocation, attack neighboring children for imagined slights, and stare at the world through eyes that seemed older and darker than any child's should be. School became a battlefield where Walter was both predator and outcast. By the time he reached 8th grade, his academic performance had deteriorated so badly that he simply stopped attending. In 1974, at just 14 years old, Walter Ellis dropped out of school entirely, leaving behind any pretense of a normal childhood and stepping into a life that would be defined by violence. The transformation was swift and terrifying. At 14, he was arrested for the first time, charged with robbery and attempted murder. The charges that would have destroyed most teenagers seemed to barely register with Walter. He paid his fine and walked free, already calculating his next move. In the following years, he would be arrested repeatedly for theft, each time receiving little more than a slap on the wrist, each time learning that the system could be manipulated, that consequences could be avoided. But these early crimes were just rehearsals for something far darker that was growing inside him. In November 1978, when Walter was 18, the pattern of petty crime escalated. He was arrested for robbery again, but this time something had changed. The violence was more calculated, more purposeful. He pled guilty and received 4 years of probation, a sentence that would prove to be catastrophically inadequate. Because Walter Ellis wasn't just a criminal learning to game the system, he was a predator learning to hunt. The 1980s brought a new level of sophistication to Walter's criminal enterprise. In 1981, he was arrested for sexual assault, a crime that should have served as a warning sign to anyone paying attention. But in the chaos of Milwaukee's overwhelmed justice system, warning signs were easy to miss. Walter served 7 months in county jail, a slap on the wrist for what prosecutors now believe was his first serious sexual offense. When he was released in May 1987, Walter immediately returned to his criminal activities, stealing and violating parole with the confidence of someone who had learned that the system was more interested in processing cases than understanding the people within them. But something else was happening during these years, something the authorities wouldn't discover until it was far too late. Walter had begun to kill. In November 1988, his criminal career took another turn when he attempted to carjack a vehicle, assaulting the arresting officer in the process. This violation of parole should have sent him away for years, but Walter served only 2 years before being released in January 1990. And it was then that he made a decision that would define the rest of his criminal life. He joined a drug trafficking organization called the Brothers of the Struggle. This wasn't just any street gang. The Brothers of the Struggle were a sophisticated criminal enterprise engaged in territorial wars throughout Milwaukee's urban core. For Walter, the organization provided something invaluable: cover. As a member of a violent drug gang, his presence in dangerous neighborhoods, his late night activities, and his connections to the street economy of sex work and addiction all became perfectly explainable. By June 1990, Walter was arrested again for drug distribution, and his extensive criminal record finally caught up with him. He was sentenced to federal prison in Minnesota, but even this setback became an opportunity. In federal prison, Walter learned to manipulate the system in ways that would later allow him to evade detection for decades. Most crucially, he became an informant. When Walter was released in the mid-1990s, he had achieved something remarkable for a career criminal. He had protection. Between 1994 and 1995, he was repeatedly arrested for assaulting girlfriends, on one occasion, injuring a woman with a screwdriver. In December 1997, he was arrested for attempted robbery and assaulted the arresting officer. But his status as an informant provided him with a shield that kept him from facing serious consequences. Time and again, charges were reduced, sentences were suspended, and Walter Ellis walked free to continue his work, both as an informant and as something far more sinister. What the authorities didn't realize was that Walter's real work wasn't providing information about drug dealers. His real work was happening in the shadows of Milwaukee's North Side, where vulnerable women were disappearing and dying in ways that fit no pattern the police could recognize. The first confirmed victim was Deborah Harris, a 31-year-old woman whose strangled body was found dumped in the Milwaukee River on October 10, 1986. The next day, October 11, 1986, 19-year-old Tanya Miller was found strangled to death. Both women were black, both were involved in sex work, and both had been sexually assaulted before being murdered. But to Milwaukee police, these weren't connected crimes. They were isolated incidents, tragic but unremarkable, in a city struggling with urban decay, drug epidemics, and street violence. The victims were women whose lives existed on the margins of society, whose deaths were easily explained by the dangerous world they inhabited. It would be years before anyone recognized that they had been hunted by the same predator. The brilliance of Walter Ellis's method wasn't in his killing technique, it was in his victim selection. He chose women who lived in the shadows, women whose disappearances wouldn't trigger massive manhunts or media attention. Sex workers, drug users, women struggling with addiction and homelessness. These were people that society had already written off, whose deaths could be easily attributed to the dangerous lifestyles they led. And Walter understood this better than anyone. He had spent his entire adult life moving through these same shadows, first as a criminal, then as an informant, always present, but never the focus of attention. He knew which neighborhoods had minimal police presence, which streets offered the best opportunities, and most importantly, which victims would be missed the least. The years between 1986 and 1992 were a period of terrifying productivity for Walter Ellis. While he continued his activities as a low-level informant, providing just enough information to maintain his protected status. He was simultaneously developing into one of Milwaukee's most prolific serial killers. On November 28, 1992, 25-year-old Irene Smith was found strangled to death, her body bearing the same signature marks that had characterized the earlier murders. But still, police didn't connect the crimes. The gaps between killings, the geographical spread across Milwaukee's north side, and the marginalized status of the victims all contributed to a collective blindness that allowed Walter to continue operating with impunity. The mid-1990s brought an escalation in both the frequency and brutality of the murders. Florence McCormick, 28 years old, was found strangled on April 24th, 1995. Just 2 months later, on June 27th, 37-year-old Sheila Ferrier's body was discovered, bearing the same marks of sexual assault and strangulation that had become Walter's signature. What makes these murders particularly chilling isn't just their brutality, but the cold calculation behind them. Walter wasn't killing in moments of rage or passion. He was hunting with the patience of a professional, selecting his victims carefully, disposing of their bodies methodically, and then disappearing back into the urban landscape where he was protected by his status as an informant and his reputation as a reliable, if unremarkable, member of the community. By this time, Walter had perfected the art of living a double life. To his neighbors in the working-class duplex where he lived, he was Walter the mechanic, the quiet man who fixed cars in his front yard and always had a joke or a story ready. He was helpful, friendly, and utterly forgettable, exactly the kind of person you'd trust to watch your children or help with groceries. But in the dark hours of Milwaukee's nights, he became something else entirely. He would cruise the streets of the North Side in his maroon 1994 Buick Century, looking for opportunities. He knew the rhythms of street life, understood the vulnerabilities of women working alone, and had developed a technique that allowed him to approach victims without raising suspicion. The psychological profile that emerges from Walter Ellis's crimes is that of a methodical predator who understood both his environment and his victims with frightening clarity. Unlike many serial killers who escalate rapidly or become increasingly disorganized, Walter maintained strict discipline over his activities. He killed only when the opportunity was perfect, disposed of bodies efficiently, and always returned to his normal life without arousing suspicion. June 20th, 1996, brought the murder of Joyce Ann Mims, a 41-year-old woman whose death followed the same pattern that had claimed 6 previous victims. But still, Milwaukee police treated these as separate crimes, investigating each murder independently without recognizing the signature that connected them all. This institutional blindness wasn't just bureaucratic incompetence, it reflected deeper societal attitudes about the value of certain lives. The victims of Walter Ellis were predominantly black women involved in sex work or struggling with addiction. Their deaths were seen as inevitable consequences of dangerous lifestyles rather than crimes deserving intensive investigation. And Walter understood this calculus perfectly. He had spent decades moving through the criminal justice system, learning its rhythms, understanding its prejudices, and recognizing its blind spots. He knew that his choice of victims would provide him with a level of protection that no amount of criminal sophistication could achieve. For over a decade after the murder of Joyce Ann Mims, Walter Ellis seemed to disappear from Milwaukee's streets. But he hadn't stopped killing, he had simply become more careful. In 1998, his protected status as an informant was revoked after he committed a series of additional offenses that made him too much of a liability to maintain. He was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment for reckless endangerment, time he served at the Oshkosh Correctional Institution. But even in prison, Walter was planning his return. When he was released in July 2001, he came back to Milwaukee with nearly 20 years of experience in killing, an intimate knowledge of police procedures, and a refined understanding of how to select victims who wouldn't be missed. On April 27, 2007, the body of Withron Stokes was discovered. The 28-year-old woman had been sexually assaulted and strangled in the same manner as the previous victims, but by this time, the Milwaukee Police Department was beginning to develop new capabilities that would finally expose Walter Ellis for what he truly was. The breakthrough came in May 2009 when Milwaukee police began using advanced DNA analysis to re-examine cold cases. What they discovered was shocking. The murders that had been treated as separate crimes for over 20 years were all connected. DNA evidence revealed that a single perpetrator was responsible for at least 7 murders spanning from 1986 to 2007. But there was a problem. When investigators tried to match the DNA evidence against the state database of convicted criminals, they couldn't find a match for Walter Ellis. His DNA samples, which should have been collected during his various incarcerations, were mysteriously missing from the system. The truth, when it was finally uncovered, revealed the depth of Walter's manipulation of the criminal justice system. During one of his previous incarcerations, he had convinced a fellow inmate to submit DNA samples under Walter's name. For years, the state database contained genetic material from an innocent man, while Walter Ellis remained invisible to scientific detection. It was only when authorities ordered Walter to provide a fresh DNA sample in late August 2009 that his decades of deception began to unravel. When he failed to appear at the police station for testing, an arrest warrant was issued and police entered his apartment. A toothbrush containing traces of his saliva was confiscated and examined. Within days, Walter Ellis's DNA was matched to 9 separate murders in a 3-mile area of northern Milwaukee. 23 years after his first confirmed killing, the Milwaukee North Side Strangler had finally been identified. On September 7th, 2009, police found Walter Ellis in a motel in Franklin, Wisconsin, where he was hiding with his 54-year-old girlfriend, Tressie Johnson. Johnson, who was not from Milwaukee, had no idea of Walter's true nature. Even more disturbing, investigators discovered that Walter was holding her against her will, suggesting that his pattern of violence against women had continued even as police closed in. At the time of his arrest, Walter was found in possession of crack cocaine and drug paraphernalia, evidence of a life that had spiraled into the same addiction and desperation that had characterized many of his victims' lives. The arrest of Walter Ellis sent shockwaves through Milwaukee's North Side community. For over 2 decades, Residents had lived with the fear that a serial killer was stalking their neighborhoods, but the revelation that the killer had been Walter Ellis, the quiet mechanic who fixed cars and helped neighbors, was almost more disturbing than the crimes themselves. He seemed like a regular guy, one neighbor told reporters. We had no idea what was happening behind closed doors. The comment captured the essential horror of Walter Ellis's crimes. He had hidden in plain sight, using the mask of normalcy to conceal a darkness that had claimed at least 7 lives. But the arrest of Walter Ellis also revealed a more disturbing truth about the institutional failures that had allowed him to operate for so long. 2 innocent men, Shante Ott and William Avery, had been convicted of murders actually committed by Walter Ellis. Both men served years in prison for crimes they didn't commit, while the real killer continued his deadly work. The case of Shante Ott was particularly tragic. In 1995, an informant named Sammy Hadaway had testified that Ott raped and killed Jessica Payne in exchange for a plea deal that would allow Hadaway to avoid a murder conviction. Hadaway's testimony was fabricated based on details provided by investigators who were desperate to solve the case. Ott was convicted in 1996 and sentenced to life in prison, serving 13 years before being exonerated by the Wisconsin Innocence Project. These wrongful convictions highlighted the same institutional prejudices and investigative failures that had allowed Walter Ellis to operate with impunity. The rush to close cases involving marginalized victims had led to a justice system more interested in quick solutions than accurate ones. On February 18, 2011, Walter Ellis entered a plea of no contest to 7 counts of first-degree intentional homicide. The plea meant that while he didn't admit guilt, he acknowledged that prosecutors had sufficient evidence to convict him. It was a cold, calculated decision that fit perfectly with the methodical approach he had taken to every aspect of his criminal career. 6 days later, on February 24, 2011, Walter Ellis was sentenced to 7 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. As he sat in the courtroom, shackled and emotionless, families of his victims finally had the opportunity to confront the man who had destroyed their lives. I pray for him to do what he has to do with his life to make himself a better person, said Mansa Miller, the brother of victim Tanya Miller. But Walter Ellis showed no emotion, no remorse, no acknowledgement of the pain he had caused. He had spent his entire adult life perfecting the art of emotional disconnection, and even in the face of justice, that mask never slipped. The sentencing brought closure to some, but it also raised troubling questions about how many other victims there might have been. Investigators believed that Walter Ellis was responsible for at least 9 murders, possibly more. Detective Steven Spingola, who had worked on 2 of the cases, expressed frustration that Walter had never provided a full confession. I just wonder about the other cases that he was mentioned in, Spingola said. There's at least 5, maybe 7 more, that he's a good suspect in that we'll probably never know. Walter Ellis was initially housed at the Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin before being transferred to the South Dakota State Penitentiary under a prisoner exchange program. For the first time in his adult life, he was completely cut off from the streets of Milwaukee that had been his hunting ground for over 2 decades. But even in prison, Walter maintained the same emotional distance that had characterized his entire criminal career. He refused interviews, provided no additional information about his crimes, and showed no interest in helping investigators understand the scope of his activities. On December 1st, 2013, Walter Ellis died in a Sioux Falls hospital of apparent natural causes. He was 53 years old and had served less than 3 years of his life sentence. His death came suddenly, without warning, and without any final revelations about the crimes that had terrorized Milwaukee for over 2 decades. The news of Walter's death was met with mixed emotions by the families of his victims. Some felt a sense of relief that he was gone, while others expressed frustration that he had taken his secrets to the grave. Detective Spingola captured the sentiment of many when he said, "He would have been an interesting person if he would have decided to sit down like Bundy at the last minute, if he knew he was dying and clear his soul, but nothing." But Walter Ellis wasn't Ted Bundy. He wasn't interested in fame, confession, or psychological analysis. He was a predator who had found a perfect ecological niche in the forgotten corners of urban America, and he had exploited that niche with methodical efficiency until scientific advances and determined investigators finally exposed him. The legacy of Walter Ellis extends far beyond the 7 confirmed murders for which he was convicted. His case highlighted systemic failures in law enforcement, the vulnerability of marginalized communities, and the ways in which prejudice and institutional indifference can create environments where predators thrive. The women who died at Walter's hands were more than victims. They were daughters, mothers, sisters, and friends whose lives had value beyond the dangerous circumstances that made them vulnerable to his predation. Deborah Harris, Tanya Miller, Irene Smith, Florence McCormick, Sheila Ferrier, Joyce Ann Mims, and Withron Stokes deserved better from the society that failed to protect them and from the justice system that initially failed to connect their deaths. But their deaths also served as a catalyst for change. The Walter Ellis case prompted improvements in DNA collection and analysis, better coordination between law enforcement agencies, and increased attention to crimes involving marginalized victims. The Wisconsin Innocence Project's work in exonerating Shante Ott and William Avery highlighted the dangers of rushed prosecutions and unreliable informant testimony. Perhaps most importantly, the case demonstrated that evil doesn't always announce itself with dramatic flourishes or obvious warning signs. Sometimes it wears the face of the helpful neighbor, the reliable mechanic, the quiet man who fixes things and minds his own business. Walter Ellis proved that the most dangerous predators are often those who master the art of invisibility, who understand that the best hiding place is in plain sight. Today, Milwaukee's North Side continues to struggle with many of the same issues that made it vulnerable to Walter Ellis's predation. Poverty, addiction, and social marginalization still create conditions where vulnerable people can disappear without generating the attention their cases deserve. But the memory of Walter Ellis serves as a reminder that behind every unsolved case, every missing person report, and every dismissed death might be a pattern waiting to be discovered. The Milwaukee North Side Strangler operated for 21 years, not because he was a criminal mastermind, but because he understood the intersection of criminal sophistication and social indifference. He knew which victims to choose, which neighborhoods to hunt, and which institutions to manipulate. Most chillingly, he knew that a society that had already written off certain people would struggle to see the pattern in their deaths. Walter Ellis died as he had lived, quietly, without drama, taking his secrets with him. But the horror he represents lives on as a warning about the dangers of institutional blindness, social prejudice, and the assumption that some lives matter less than others. In the end, his greatest crime wasn't the murders he committed, but the system of indifference that allowed him to commit them for over 2 decades. The story of Walter Ellis is ultimately a story about the shadows that exist in every community, the vulnerabilities that every society must confront, and the price we pay when we allow certain people to become invisible. It's a reminder that evil often succeeds not through dramatic gestures, but through quiet persistence, and that justice delayed can become justice denied for both victims and the communities they leave behind.